Hello, my name is Przemek Piwowar, and I'm hosting the next part of the conference. Let me remind you that during the conference, you can ask questions to our speakers through the Slack platform. We are in the pink room, so please join the channel main ping and type a question. If you can't join the Slack, you can type question directly to me on Gator. I'm standing in the right up corner in the pink room, so feel free to ask a question to our speakers. Before I introduce our next speaker, let me share with you one of my personal experiences. A few years ago, my teams struggled with proper communications. Of course, everyone speaks the same language, but at the end of the day, they often had different understanding of how to do something. Of course, they were very intelligent people, but they had different backgrounds: business analysts, technical analysts, software developers, and testers. I was very confused, but decided to find resolution, and this resolution finally boosted efficiency in my teams. How I did it? I started Googling. I found Free Amigos practice and Seb Rose behind. I found Gherkin language and Seb Rose behind. I found whole behavior-driven development thinking and Seb Rose behind. And finally, I found Cucumber, and guess who was behind? After 1 month, I was scary and afraid to open the fridge in my house. So, ladies and gentlemen, I have a great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Seb Rose, a legend of BDD. Seb, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Przemek. You're very kind. I should point out that there are lots of people whose shoulders that I stood upon in the BDD world. Starting with Dan North, Matt Wynn, Aslak Hirsoy, and many others. So the BDD community is a large community and it's a welcoming community. So please, any of you that start on the journey, go to the cucumber.io website and you will find the Cucumber BDD Slack workspace where you can ask questions of committers and other users of the products. So this session is called Example Mapping, a structured collaborative discovery technique. And I just want to point out that behavior-driven development is a set of 3 practices: discovery, formulation, and automation. And example mapping is one way to conduct the discovery practice of behavior-driven development. We happen to think it's the best way, and that's why we've been promoting it quite heavily for the past 5 years or so. Try it out. Let me know how you get on. So the reason we go through discovery and the reason why we use example mapping is to make sure that we really understand the requirements of the next story that we're going to implement. And whenever someone comes to you with a requirements document, there's often a number of questions that you ask about them, because no matter how hard people try to write really clear requirements, we as professionals with experience in a particular domain always have extra questions that somehow the people who wrote the requirements don't seem to have thought about. And so you'll find yourself asking these sort of questions that are on the screen. And one of the best ways that we found to get to the bottom of any misunderstandings or any gaps in a requirement is to say, give me an example of what you mean here. And this concrete example is a really good questioning technique to make sure that we understand what's being asked of us, and we can know about all of the edge cases. And that's how Matt Wynn came to create a technique called example mapping. So he was working with the team and they were having problems making sure that everyone understood the same things from the requirements. And he happened to have in his pocket, and this really was just pure fluke, he had in his pocket a pack of index cards in 4 colors. So you could maybe go to your local stationers and you'll see these packs of index cards that come in 4 colors. And he just started by using the yellow card, and he wrote the story that the team was discussing on the yellow card. And then he took the blue cards and he wrote each acceptance criteria on one of the blue cards. And I'll get to why I just said acceptance criteria, but it says rule on the screen in just a minute. And then he asked the teams to come up with questions that they had, but frame them in the form of an example. How did this rule behave in this situation? And put those on green cards underneath. And when people found that there were questions in the room that couldn't be answered, he encouraged people, rather than sort of discussing it and voicing their opinions and generally wasting time having a fun discussion, let's just write that question onto a red card, ensure that at the end of the example mapping session, each red card has an owner, and get that question answered definitively before the next time we come back to this example map to try and finish the process. In the white box at the bottom right of the slide, you'll see that there's a link to Matt's original blog post called Introducing Example Mapping. That's very much well worth a read. And there's also a link to a YouTube video of Aslak conducting an example mapping session. So let's get the synonym thing out of the way to start with. So on the previous slide, we had a blue card and it had the word rule in it. And we use rule throughout example mapping for the blue cards. We call these blue cards rule cards. But in the world of Agile and getting requirements sorted, rules are synonymous with requirements and acceptance criteria. And you might be sitting there thinking, these are all different things. What's that? Why is he calling these synonyms? Well, a rule is about how the system is supposed to behave when it's developed. A requirement is a requirement about how the system is supposed to behave once it's developed. And an acceptance criterion is a check that you make about how the system behaves when it's been developed. Therefore, these are really all the same thing. I'm sure people can come up with fine differences about why they should be used in a different way, but in general, we treat them as synonyms. And so for the purposes of the rest of this session, please, when I say rule, remember that this is also a requirement and an acceptance criterion. So I'm going to do a sample run through a very small, very simple example mapping session. And I'm going to use this sample rule, which is only library members are permitted to reserve items. So this is within the context of a story within a public library where you can borrow books, and these books that they are free to borrow. But if you want to reserve one that's currently out on loan, you have to pay a charge. So this is a sample rule. If you want to reserve a book that's out on loan, you have to pay a fee, as I said, and the fee has been specified at £1. So let's run this example mapping session very quickly. The product owner comes to the example mapping session with the story and the candidate rule or rules already thought about and written out on cards. So the story is apply reservation charges to library members. So we're going to charge library members a charge to reserve a book. And the rule, as we saw earlier, was members should pay a reservation charge. And specifically here, the charge is £1. I'm from the UK, so I'm afraid we're not using euros. So we've got this, we're in the room. The product owner has shown us these, the story and the rule. And now we have the other members of the three amigos in the room that will include at least one person with a development perspective and at least one person with a test perspective. And they want to ask questions using concrete examples to ensure that they understand this. So maybe Joanna comes up with this example. Andrew reserves a book, he's charged £1. And she puts it on the table and she basically looks to the product owner to ask the question, is this what you mean? Is this a correct example based on your understanding of what you're asking for? And the product owner, Patricia, looks at this and goes, yes, this is an entirely correct example. And then Davita comes up with another example and she asks, well, if Andrew reserves 2 books, he's charged £1. And Patricia looks at this and she goes, no, that's not what I expected. What I had in my mind is that if Andrew reserves 2 books, then he should be charged £2. Ah, say the team. Well, let's refine the rule and make it where the members pay a reservation charge of £1 per item. So as you see here, what happened was we used examples to ensure that everyone had a shared understanding. And based on that refined understanding, we made change to the rule. The requirement got modified, or at least clarified, by the action of example mapping. Then David says, well, okay, maybe, I guess for 2 books is £2, 3 books is £3. How many books is Andrew allowed to reserve? At which point Patricia thinks about it and says, well, actually, I'm not sure. So rather than having a discussion about how many books Andrew or any other library member is allowed to reserve, Patricia writes down the question on a red card, and she volunteers to take ownership of that, and she's going to go back to the library staff or library management to get a definitive answer to this, which she can bring back to the team at the next example mapping session. So this, as you can see, is a very, very simple story with a single rule that is being delivered by the story. Typically, a story will deliver more than one rule, but for the purposes of this session, of this sample, I wanted to show something really small. But you've seen how a rule could be clarified through the use of examples. You've seen how question cards can be used to basically shut down a discussion when no one has a definitive answer just yet. So that is example mapping in a nutshell. Let's just quickly talk about examples. So examples are made up of 3 parts, and all examples have these 3 parts. They have a context, an action, and an outcome. So the context is where we say what's happened in the world to put the system into the state in which the action that we're about to take will result in the outcome that we are expecting. So it's like setup and then event, and then making sure that the expectations are satisfied. And if we think about it within the context of the example, Andrew reserves a book, he is charged £1. Well, the action is that Andrew is reserving 1 book. The outcome is that Andrew is charged £1. And then the question is, well, what's the context? We've used all the information that's on the example card. But if we look back up in the example map, we see that this example was illustrating the rule, library members pay a reservation charge of £1 per item. So the context here is that Andrew is a library member. And now we have the 3 parts of a concrete example, which is context, action, and outcome. As I was talking about it, we was talking about how we were capturing the example by having the testers or developers or other members of the 3 amigos writing their examples on green cards. And this is capturing it as prose, and it's a very useful way of writing out an example and getting response from your product owner or business analyst. It has to be said, though, that prose is not structured. That's not a bad thing, but in certain situations, it can be a hard way. It can be hard for the product owner or business analyst to parse and respond to examples written in this format. Other formats that we've used over the years that we find to be useful is using a column structure on an example card. So we just divide the card into 3 columns. The leftmost column represents the context, the middle column represents the action, and the rightmost column represents the outcome. And then we write a note in each of these columns to represent the context, action, and outcome. This is more structured. And for some examples and for some teams, this works a lot better. This doesn't lend itself very well to being used using online environments. We'll talk about how example mapping can be done remotely in a few minutes, but this doesn't work very well remotely, or at least I haven't found it to work well. So when we work remotely, myself and Gashfar Noj have used this technique where we use a symbol at the beginning of the line to determine or to identify whether the line represents a context, an action, or an outcome. And we decided to use a hyphen an asterisk, and an arrow sign for context, action, and outcome, respectively. And we've documented this in our books, so you can have a look at some of the examples in there as well, should you decide to. However, textual examples aren't the only way of doing it. So some things, especially UI requirements, can often be more easily communicated using a sketch. So don't feel limited by the textual approaches that I've shown in the previous slides. By all means, use a sketch to try and make it clear the example that you are trying to use to illustrate the rule. It's whatever works best for the context of your team, for the particular requirement you're working on. One of the great things about example mapping, it isn't just that it gets you very quickly to a shared understanding, but there's a really good amount of visual feedback that you get from working through an example map. If you see an example map like this, where we only have a story and some rules, it's pretty clear that we haven't had any great discussion, we haven't created any detailed, concrete examples to illustrate the rules, and that this story is not ready for us to pull onto a sprint backlog or to begin working on. It's just not ready. We haven't talked about it. We can't be sure that we have a shared understanding of what's being asked for. Now, this example map shows us that we have definitely had some discussions around the story and the rules that it's going to deliver. But we have a couple of examples on the left that they're examples of how we think the system should behave, but they aren't illustrating either of the rules that have been proposed so far. So what this is telling us is that either these examples are out of scope, or if the product owner accepts they should be delivered by this story, then we're missing a rule, we're missing a requirement from this story, and we're going to need to create it. We can do that in the example mapping session, or the product owner could go away and think about it on their own. If you find you've got lots of red question cards, or even maybe you've got one red question card, that probably means that there are too many unknowns to be able to pull this story into the sprint backlog. It's not ready to be worked on yet, because depending on the answers to those questions, the implementation and the behavior of the story may change. If you end up with lots and lots of rules, even if they did have examples underneath them, if you have lots of rules, that's a good feedback that probably this story is too big. I have a very strict approach to stories. I believe that they should be delivered from the backlog to done in 3 days or less. And my rule of thumb is that I really would like to see 3 rules or fewer on a story. This is only a heuristic. Some rules are very small, I accept that. But if you see a lot of rules on an example map, the chances are that you can split this story into 2 or more smaller stories simply by taking rules that sit in the same space, that are close in functionality, and separating them apart and just putting them under different yellow story cards. Because the story is just a description, a narrative description. It's the rules that deliver functional behavior. If you see an example map like this, it's potentially ready to be brought into the sprint, into the active working pile of stories. I say potentially ready because there may still be questions that people want to ask. They may have come up with examples to challenge them. So at the end of an example mapping session, if we have a story, an example map like looks like this, we typically ask everyone in the room to do what is called Roman voting, which is, are you happy with the example map as it stands just now? Are you unhappy? You've got more areas that you want to investigate, or you easy either way. And as long as there's nobody that's unhappy, now this potentially ready story can be accepted into the next sprint or the next iteration. So far, I've been using rectangles on the screen to represent these index cards that I talked about that Matt Wynne used when he created example mapping. However, over the past year or two, we've all got used to working from home online remotely. And so we don't get into a room and have index cards that we push around on a table. There are a number of ways that we've found that work very well for working remotely doing example mapping. We've used remote spreadsheets, so Google Sheets works well. Excel in Office 365 works not quite as well, but reasonably well. And we just use colored cells on a spreadsheet to represent the different cards. Gojko Agic and his colleagues have created a tool called MindMap, or in fact, it's now MindMap 2. It's also very useful for doing example mapping. You create nodes and you can color them accordingly. Miro, which has become very popular over the past year or so, has a user story mapping template, which you can repurpose as an example mapping template. You have to reset the colors a little bit, but it's very useful. It's extremely good for collaborative working. And then finally, SmartBear has developed a specific and dedicated example mapping tool that's currently hosted inside of CucumberStudio. And the benefit that you get here is that because it's specifically around example mapping, it understands a few of the changes that you might want to do. It helps you split stories, move rules around with all of the examples that are associated with them, and so on and so forth. So there's plenty of choices when it comes to doing example mapping remotely. So that pretty much takes me to the end of the practical demonstration of example mapping. What I'd like to do now is sort of sum up sort of 9 of the core things that I've found about teaching and implementing example mapping in teams around the world. The first thing is keep example mapping short. Nobody likes long meetings, or at least I hope none of you like long meetings. But short meetings are not just more fun, but they're more productive. After a 30-minute meeting, or rather 30 minutes into a meeting, if you have been deeply engaged in that meeting, you will be tired. You will begin to be getting less productive. People will start looking at their Facebook or their Slack or their Twitter. So keep the example mapping short, but my recommendation is to do it frequently. So what I tend to get teams to do when they first start working on example mapping is to schedule an example mapping daily. After stand-up is my typical recommendation because everybody's already together, but nonetheless, schedule it daily. Now, that doesn't mean we have to spend 30 minutes every day doing an example mapping. It's much easier to give time back than it is to try and allocate time. So what this is giving yourself an option to have example mapping every day. If you have enough stories that have been example mapped to keep your backlog full, then you don't need to do any more example mapping in the current iteration. That seems straightforward. So that's the plan. Keep the mapping short, schedule them every day. The other benefit of having a daily example mapping is that if an example mapping throws up a red question card or cards, then when the answer arrives, or rather, as soon as the answer arrives, you already have the next example mapping scheduled where you can incorporate that answer into your example map. As I mentioned as I went through, every unanswered question, every red card should have an owner. That owner isn't necessarily the person who will answer the question. It's the person who's responsible for making sure that the question gets answered. If we have a scheduled example mapping every day, that's great. We know there's going to be example mapping. However, with a 30-minute session, it's really important that when we get to that example mapping, we get moving really fast, that we can begin to be productive within the first minute or two. And one of the things that I found has been useful is to have the product owner or business analyst give notice the day before about the story that's going to be discussed tomorrow. That allows the team to self-select who's going to go. It gives people a time to think about the story and maybe come up with their first questions. It gives people time to maybe get up to speed in that area of the domain. Otherwise, you're going to get into the example mapping session and you're going to have to bring your head into that space, get the context, all as part of that 30 minutes. Not everyone in the team needs to attend. When we start doing example mapping with a team, I typically do have the whole team attend so that we can get a shared way of working. However, in the long run, I find that if there's more than 6 people in the room, it's really hard to keep it down to a focused discussion where there's only one person speaking at a time. It's sort of like the dinner party effect. If you have 5 or fewer people in a room, there's one conversation that everyone can join in with. If you've got more than 6 in a room, you typically have 2 or more conversations going at any one time, which makes it harder for the product owner to keep their attention on what's being asked through the examples. As I said earlier, example mapping is an example of a 3 amigos meeting, and therefore we need to have representatives of business, dev, and test for it to be okay, for it to have enough people there, enough perspectives. It doesn't mean there should be 3 people there. It doesn't mean these are the only perspectives that should be represented. You may need someone from security. You may want people from UX. It really depends on the story being discussed. Hence why you want to give people at least 24 hours notice of what will be discussed at the example mapping session. The responsibility of the product owner or the business analyst is to bring the story and their candidate rules. I underline candidate here because, as we saw in our sample session, the rule may get refined. New rules may get created. Rules may get changed. The product or business analyst may have thought about examples while they were thinking through their story and their rules, but they should not bring the examples to the example mapping session. It is the job of the team to basically drag knowledge out of the product owner or business analyst by creating the examples themselves. It's their engagement with the problem through creating the examples which enables learning and discovery. There's a tendency when we get into a meeting to do a lot of talking. I'd like to ask people not to talk at the beginning of an example mapping session, but just to write examples. You will end up with people around the table coming up with duplicate examples. This is not a problem. These can be deleted, aligned, merged together. What we want to do is ensure that everything gets captured on the example cards. Because the worst thing that can happen is that we come out of an example mapping session where some useful and meaningful information was exchanged in a conversation, but was never captured on an example card, and therefore is transient knowledge that will not be present to anyone in the future. It's not being recorded. And finally, these 30-minute sessions, we've got to keep the information flowing. We need to keep the examples being created really easily. I showed a number of different patterns to use it, to capture it, either just textual prose or using columns or using symbols. The point here, though, is that we may be identifying context, action, outcome, but what we don't want to do is get into the really quite detailed activity of making sure that the language is correct for persistent documentation. That's the BDD practice of formulation, of turning it into given, when, then, using business terminology that's totally precise. This is an absolutely necessary activity, but it's not something that we should try to do at the example mapping session. So in the example mapping session, don't use given, when, then. Don't argue too much about the language that you're using. You need to make sure that it's not ambiguous, but during the discovery process, during example mapping, we're trying to focus on prioritize exchange of information rather than getting the documentation correct. And those are my 9 key takeaways. Thank you very much for coming along to the session. I'd be very happy to answer your questions just now. If I don't get to your question, then please do contact me via Twitter or via email, and I'd be happy to talk with you at any time. Thank you.
Thank you, Seb, for a very interesting presentation. But we have some questions to you. On the last slide, you answer most of them, but still we have some questions. One of the questions is, it should be smaller or bigger event. You said about Three Amigos rules. You said about that we need a perspective of development, business, and quality. You said about 6 people in the room. Do you think that example mapping is possible in very large or larger group for 20 people or 30, 40? What do you think?
Okay. So it's certainly possible. It's whether it's effective. When you get into those large numbers of creating examples, my feeling of my experience is that some people engage and write lots of examples, and some people check their email or do something else. Now, that's not to say we can't create large numbers of examples with 30 or 40 people. But then we have the problem of, do we have more than one product owner that's able to give effective responses to those examples, to essentially go, yes, that example is a correct example. If we've got 30 people creating examples and only one product owner, then we're going to have a real bottleneck. So people are creating examples and they don't know whether that example is a correct example or not. And they may have to wait minutes for the product owner to respond to it. I don't know what context this question comes from. So I can't answer definitively for the person who's asking the question. I guess the point is that most, well, certainly Scrum teams recommend 7 plus or minus 2 people. If you've got 30 people, that sounds like several teams. And I'm wondering if example mapping is the right technique to use. Remember, example mapping is detailed discovery to make a story, to refine a story so that it's ready to be worked on tomorrow effectively. There are other techniques, event storming, user story mapping, that are larger group techniques for trying to do big picture thinking and try and identify slices of functionality that can be delivered. So without more context, I can't say whether it would work for the person asking the question, but I haven't done example mapping with teams that large. 10, 12, 15 is about the biggest that I've got to, and 15 is quite painful.
Thank you. And the next question is there value in inviting stakeholders to give an context? Because often business don't get involved often at all because they don't have a time. Do you think it's a good idea to invite them such a session to give a context? What do you think about it?
Yeah, so I mean, you know, the ASLAC is on record as saying that Cucumber is the world's most misunderstood collaboration tool. Behavior-driven development is a collaborative activity, and I put collaborative in the title of this session. And the collaboration requires business involvement. And the product owner should really be a business-facing individual. And I absolutely feel your pain. Business people frequently don't make themselves available to the development team. That's something that I'm afraid is required for a successful adoption of behavior-driven development. You need to have someone representing the business to have that context on the behavior that they require, that they're looking for. And it's one of the major changes that we see in teams that do successfully adopt BDD. They do get more engagement from their business people. Their business people begin to see that their relationship with the delivery team as being just as important as their relationship with the customer. And without that, it's not to say you won't have a successful product, but it's much harder. And you can create proxies for the business. So you can have a team lead or a tester or a UX person try and act the role of business person, but you get the same latency and feedback problems that you get from having a product owner that really doesn't own the product. You know, it's a proxy there giving their best answer, but in the end, even having given an answer, they still have to go back to the source of truth, which is the actual owner or the actual customer, and then that feedback might change the answer that they give. So it just introduces risk and uncertainty and delay into the process.
Okay, thank you. So the next question, it is a very popular practice for teams to prepare a quarterly plan at the level of very large or huge product backlog items, for example, epics or even something more bigger. Do you think that on a high level of backlog refinement, this method may be useful or can be modified? So can we use example mapping in huge product backlog items?
Well, you can, but I think I refer to my previous answer. I think they're a more appropriate techniques. So user story mapping, event storming. These are techniques for beginning to understand the larger picture. The problem always with doing big items in a quarterly mapping, which I totally understand why it's necessary, but the problem with that is that something until you get down to the detail, it's really hard to know how big or how complicated the story is. So I'm sure we've all done this, right? Someone has come up to you and said, hey, can you make this change to the system? And you think about it for 2 minutes and go, yeah, I can have that ready for you by the end of the week. And then you sit down to do it, and suddenly it's, oh, I forgot about this complication, or, oh, I need to work with that team over there. And suddenly the thing that you thought you could do in a few days is something that's going to take a few weeks. And when you're talking about big features, epic type features that are sitting on a backlog, that's very regular. In fact, it's built into the agile way of managing scope. The idea of being able to manage delivery in an agile way of working is that you make promises to deliver some functionality in specific areas of the product, but you understand that you will be able to manage that delivery to schedule by modifying the scope. So you may deliver all of a feature, or you may deliver just a part of a feature that helps you move in that direction. So by doing example mapping, if you were actually to do example mapping on each of your big ticket items, you would end up with lots and lots of detail. That's not what you want to do 3 months beforehand, because most of that detail you may never get to in the next quarter. So my answer is examples can be used at a high level. I have seen people try and use example mapping for quarterly planning. I don't believe it's successful in general. It's certainly not what example mapping was created. It's not the problem example mapping was created to address. And I believe there are more suitable techniques for doing that big picture planning than example mapping.
Thank you. And can you imagine any scenarios that we can fail with example mapping? Are there any traps?
So, I mean, I think we've covered a few of them. Not having the business involved is a trap. You know, we will end up with latency. If we don't manage to get those example mapping sessions happening on a regular basis, that's a trap. If we try and do too much example mapping up front, so example map the whole product backlog, for instance, that's a trap. It's part of an agile process. It's a discussion technique. If we deal with the challenges that I identified, or at least if we adopt the recommendations that I identified on that final slide of 9 takeaways, I have never seen example mapping fail to deliver value to a team. It's not to say that just because you do example mapping, every project's going to be successful. That would be a foolish claim to make, and I'm not making it. But example mapping itself is just a structured collaboration technique. And I have never seen it fail to assist collaboration. Having said that, the world is full of people who can break almost anything. There are people who are not open to various techniques. And if you're dealing with people that are obstructive, then it's not just example mapping that would fail, but any form of structured technique to try and aid communication is liable to have challenges.
Thank you. Another question, is it a good idea to mix example mapping session with estimate story?
Good question. So I would say, so my ideal, let's talk about my ideal first. So we don't mix them. What I would like to do is I would like to get to a point where we have the example mapping that ensures that we identify all of the rules that need to be delivered for the story. Then we look at that story, and based on our experience of our rules, we maybe look at the number of rules and decide to split it into a smaller story. And my goal, right, this is my goal, is I reach a point where there's only one story size, which is it's story sized, which means we can deliver it in 3 days or fewer. In fact, there's a wonderful deck of estimation cards. They're not quite planning poker cards, but they're produced by a Polish company whose name currently escapes me. I will remember it and share it with you afterwards. But it has 3 cards in the planning poker deck. It has a 1 for this is a story size story, which means that we can deliver it in my case, in 3 days or fewer. Then it has a TFB card, which stands for too big. And it has got an NFC card for no clue. TFB, too big, means we need to split it. That means it wasn't a story size. It means we don't believe we can deliver it in 3 days or fewer. NFC means, actually, I don't really understand the story yet, which means it hasn't properly been through the example mapping session. So go back to your question. Should we do estimation during the example mapping session? No. I believe what we should do at the example mapping session is aim to get story-sized stories. And the final goal would be to have just rather estimating how big a story is to ensure that all stories are deliverable in 3 days or fewer, and therefore decide how much to move into the next iteration based on the number of stories we want to bring in. On the way there, you will probably carry on doing story estimation. And at that point, I would still suggest when you do your sprint planning, you bring the stories along and you will be able to estimate them very quickly because you will have already got a deep understanding, having done example mapping, and you will see how big they are by seeing how many rules and examples are on the example map for that story.
Okay, thank you. We are living in a world surrounded by very complex products. So the question is do you think that this method is good for every product?
Well, so it'd be rash for me to say every product. I've not worked on every product, but I don't believe that complexity is something that precludes using example mapping. I mean, examples are how the scientific method works, for instance. So you come up with a hypothesis, you construct an experiment, you measure the data, and you see whether the system has behaved according to your hypothesis. And if it works for nuclear physics maybe artificial intelligence, let's cover that one in a second. If it works with nuclear physics, then it will definitely work with lots of complex systems. So I don't think the complexity is an issue. Non-determinacy is a problem. And there's an awful lot of work in the AI space at the moment where it's not clear to me whether we have a scientific method yet or not. So a lot of and I'm not an AI specialist or a scientist of that nature at all. So I'm speaking here somewhat out of my comfort zone. But it seems to me that a lot of the techniques that are currently used for machine learning with training sets and artificial intelligence building upon that machine learning has problems in it, and I'm not sure that example mapping would help with that. So for instance, one of the large issues that we have with AI and machine learning is that the learning is very much biased by the data that is used for doing the training. And it's difficult to see how an example mapping session would be able to help with that. That's not to say we couldn't find a way of doing it, but there are systemic problems that outside the deterministic scientific approach that example mapping encapsulates. So yeah, maybe for some AI systems, it would be difficult to use example mapping. However, the problem is not, I think, so much with example mapping, but with our inner biases and trying to cope with those.
Okay, thank you. I think that you inspire Martina to introduce this example mapping in the team. She's wondering how long she should working with the team and how many sessions they should have to recognize that they doing this properly way.
Okay, so what I've been doing within SmartBear, where I've been introducing example mapping through a number of teams, is I do a 3-hour training session, and then they invite me along to each of their example mapping sessions for the next month. And through that month, I attend each example mapping session. I help them when they have problems. I correct them where I think they're going off the rails. And at the beginning, for the first week, I definitely go to every example mapping session. By the third week, I'm generally going to fewer example mapping sessions. And by the end of the month, I stop going regularly and wait to be pulled in when they have issues. So I think it's one of those techniques that isn't super hard, as long as you get good practices to start with. And 1 month of investment of half an hour a day from a facilitator is sufficient to get teams working correctly. That's not to say they won't need help in the future. And in many organizations, team members move on a regular basis. So it's also been my experience that I have done refresher courses where 3 people have been on the course before and 5 people are new. And so again, then I come back and participate in their example mapping sessions after the refresher course to get everybody on the same page.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any other questions. So, Seb, thank you very much. You showed us another great tool that we can take and include to our toolbox and improve our daily work. But we have to be aware that many of Agile tools are just triggers to efficient and proper communications or even interactions. So in the Agile Manifesto, we have interactions over processes and tools. So Seb, thank you for tools that improve our interactions. So if you want to know more about Seb and great tools, I strongly recommend you to visit pages Cucumber.io, Clay Snow CO UK, and bddbooks.com. Thank you very much. And now we have a short break.